Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Planter Sessions brought to you by the Geneva Push. This is, in fact, our second session of Planter Sessions, and today we have Andrew Hurd and Mikey Lynch to chat to you. Andrew Hurd specifically talking on reaching a region. Before we get to that, though, we have a couple of things to go through. We'd like to let you know, firstly, that this is going to be a solid half hour, and in fact, a tight half hour, so you can dedicate the time to it, listen carefully, get your questions in, and enjoy what you're going to get, and not worried that it's going to drag on for the rest of the day. We also will have a special emphasis on the practical. So we'll be looking for particular things that we can go away from this session with about reaching a region. How will you actually implement this? And that's really what we're trying to do to be helpful to you. Also, along the way, you'll be able to submit questions. So after we've done the main interview between Mikey and Andrew, store up your questions because you'll have an opportunity to ask them of Andrew, and we'll be able to respond. Now, we have a fair number of people attending today, so if you don't get to your question, if we're not able to put it to Andrew, then feel free to submit it anyway. I receive a copy of that, and we'll see if we can't get some answers to those in coming weeks. And also, it's worth saying that at present, do not worry if you're not seeing video. The only thing that should be on your screen at the moment is the planner session PowerPoint. That's because we'll be introducing video in the next couple of weeks. It's all about audio at the moment. And this audio will in fact be available on the website in a week's time after we have finished editing it down and recording it. Right now, though, the first thing I want to do is to introduce our main sponsor. EA Insurance is actually making this possible so that church planters could go out and actually learn as much as they can from each other. And now, if you've done nothing about insurance yet for your church plant, or if in fact you've come across a whole new situation you're not really sure what to do with, we actually would like to recommend EA Insurance to you. The Geneva Push is quite happy with the services they provide, and they can pretty much help you sort out everything from public liability to property insurance and contents and so forth, and probably, as I said, issues you haven't even thought of yet. So feel free to check out ea.org.au for all the information you'll need there. Well, without further ado, I think it's time that I actually bring Mikey Lynch and Andrew Hurd into the conversation to talk to us about the very thing we're here for today. Mikey Lynch is the director of the Geneva Push, in fact, one of the founding directors and a church planner in his own right. He's joining us from Tasmania, and I guess I should hand over to him now to introduce Andrew.
Thanks, Mark, and hi, everyone. Andrew Hurd, pastor at EV Church in the Central Coast. You guys got a vision to reach the Central Coast, 300,000 people. Is that right, Andrew?
Yeah, absolutely.
You began in Gosford, though, is that right? Which is about half that amount of people?
Yeah, within about 20 minutes drive of us, there's about 75,000 people. Maybe a bit more, but yeah, it's quite a large chunk still, nonetheless. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you guys began, which was what, over 12 years ago now?
16 years.
16 years ago?
Yeah.
1996. Did you start with the 70,000 or did you start with the 300,000 as the vision?
Yeah, I started with 240,000 actually. So 16 years ago, the Central Coast, the region of the Central Coast was 240,000. It was growing at about 5,000, maybe 5 to 10,000 a year at that stage. So it was a high growth there. But yeah, no, we started the church with the thought of the Central Coast as a region reaching the current population and where it would keep growing.
Okay. Now, beginning that way with this regional vision, which is the focus of this webinar, how does that kind of goal, that scope, how does it change the kind of attitude you bring as you kick a church off?
Yeah, well, I can tell you what it did for me.
Yeah.
How much that might be different from others is another thing, but certainly what it did for me was it made us think bigger. It made us think long term. It made us think proactively, and I thought about myself differently. So there's a few good things. So that we thought, obviously we're thinking bigger. When we were planning the church, we weren't just thinking about, reaching a few thousand people around us, and so building a church of maybe the 50 to 100 and 150. We were thinking quite proactively about how we're going to reach this whole region, which obviously begged a question of numbers of churches, because given the 300,000, the size of the place and the distances, we couldn't do it with one church. So immediately we were spun out into thinking lots of churches. but which meant I was thinking about myself differently. I wasn't thinking about myself as a pastor of a church. I was thinking of myself as the facilitator of the mission in this region. So that was a whole kind of frame of reference I brought to it.
Yeah, that's massive thought, isn't it? That in that sense, the planting of the one church is part of a much larger thing that you're a part of, and where you may go, or where that church may go over time, is in a sense up for grabs, right?
Yeah. One of the first practical things it impacted actually was where we planted. So as I was looking at the Central Coast, one of the early thoughts that we worked on was, where's the best place to build a beachhead from which we could launch out other works to reach everywhere on the coast. I remember early on we were criticised for not planting in the disadvantaged areas, so-called. I mean, there's a sense in which everywhere is disadvantaged, but the more recognisable social economic
Didn't Jesus come to seek and save those who were the poor and the sinner and so on and so forth?
Yeah. And so we were criticised for it. We didn't go to the place with the highest proportion of single mothers and crime rate and so on and so forth. But my intention was to get there. It's just that, in my estimation, the best way to get there with a sustainable ministry was to do it by starting in a place where we could build a foundation, create a beachhead, and then launch from there, which has been the 16-year journey.
Yeah.
So actually, we have actually planted into that region now, but I trust under God we've done it in a way that is sustainable, and it's proving to be so.
Yeah. What are the? Did you notice practically early on in trying to cast that regional vision, did you find that there was constantly kind of an elastic snap back into a suburban or town-centered vision amongst your people?
Oh yeah, totally. Well, it wasn't actually an elastic snap back as so much as firstly getting the stretch out. Do you know what I mean? Like it was interesting.
There was no elastic.
We didn't have any stretch. It was very early on. One of the first practical things I did was begin talking about the reality of what we were trying to be, and the goal for mine wasn't simply viability, and it wasn't simply our friends. It was actually the 240,000, now the 300,000. And so I often had conversations with people who were coming to our church about what they thought the end picture should be. What's success? What does it look like to have achieved our goal as a church? And it was interesting in all of that through conversation, questioning and discussion, it came out very often that people were thinking in terms of the church they'd seen down the road, the church they might have grown up at. And
could I sharpen the question in terms of working with your team and other leaders by saying, on these areas you raised, like the thinking bigger, the thinking multiple churches, the thinking about how you saw yourself differently, were there kind of swear jar kind of statements where certain phraseology that kind of reflected the unhelpful, smaller attitude? Were there kind of key phrases that you tried to sort of chuck out of the vocabulary as you spoke? And people sometimes talk about our little church, for example, as kind of a nice cutesy way of talking about church life.
Yeah, that's good, Mikey. I think one of the things I avoided was the pastoral language. Now, I think we have a problem today in that we couch that term and fill it with all kinds of things that aren't necessarily biblical, but nonetheless it's a word now that has its own meaning amongst many, and so I avoided using that because it conveyed the sense of responsive, reactive, sit by the bedside, hold a hand kind of ministry, internal, inward focused. So I didn't use that language so much as leadership and mission, and the bigger vision external to us. And so I kept trying to cast the vision in terms of not what we would be as a care body, but as what would be as a bringing the kingdom to this 300,000 community body. And so there's one very small thing that I kept working at doing. Yeah.
Great. Let's push on. I'm just conscious of the time thing. What were, as you think regionally, were there different kinds of ways of approaching outreach, ministry structure, promotion? Did things, the kind of things you considered, change because you were thinking that larger vision?
Yeah, look, I guess to underline the conversations early on were very important because they began, I think, to change the way people thought about church. Church, we use the language of lifeboat all the time. Church is a lifeboat. It's here on a mission to rescue. The experience of the church gathering itself may not be the mission structure, but nonetheless, us who are gathered are to be on that mission. And that whole language and conception began to filter through so that we were freed up more to actually ask the harder questions of, if we're going to reach actually 300,000 people and not just build a church of 150, 200, what are the hard decisions we need to make? What are the ways we need to structure that will be different perhaps from what people had experienced in other churches? And so it drove us down the path of more specialised ministries, greater investment in various areas of work, determination to sacrifice in ways we might not otherwise do, and so on.
Yeah. To just zero in on one, think about mission. If you're thinking suburb, then immediately in my mind a bunch of things come into play about a strong friendship evangelism strategy, perhaps even just a core church community, inviting people in to do life together with that church, and that becomes this central evangelistic strategy, maybe door knocking one block over and over again, those kinds of strategies. When you think regional, there's a lot of blocks to door knock, and that's one massive church barbecue to have. So how do you do mission differently when you're thinking a regional at the Central Coast, or a centre city area, or a whole region of a city where you're dealing with tens and hundreds of thousands?
Yeah. The we weren't just interested in doing the small thing. We were thinking faster and larger, or at least I was, and people I was trying to talk to persuade about where we were going. We wanted to do faster and larger, which meant I wasn't content for us, the leadership weren't content for us to merely move along with the one-to-one work only, although we've got a deep commitment to one-to-one work and the walking alongside people and getting into missional situations and so on. But the investing our church into, the neighbour only was never going to reach 300,000 people, 30,000. We've gone for the 10% vision, so 30,000 is the big number we use all the time. And so that drove us to think, how can we mobilise our work across the body and use the resources more broadly than just friendship lounge room work. And so one of the things that spun out of that was an awareness of, we need to analyse, are there ways that mobilising together we can have bigger impact than just me on my own doing a small work with my friend, who may or may not be interested, and I might invest 10 years in my friend and never get any response. How can I actually mobilise us together to reach the low fruit? So I kept thinking in terms of, let's find the warm contacts, find ways to actually spread out the connection of EV Church to as many people as possible to provide a touch with the warm person, and then zero our resource into there and work the networks and kind of lines along that relationship structure.
We're about to throw to questions, Andrew, so I'll just give one quick thing. If you had to give one thing, if you were chatting with a bloke who wanted to broaden the vision of his ministry and his church, if there was one thing that you reckon would be a helpful exercise for them to do, or them to do with their kind of core team, what would be kind of one first step to break out into this kind of regional vision?
I think in part it's a spiritual issue. It's the concern is actually to get me as the leader and the close leadership that I work with to really get a vision of what God is about in reaching not just people who are close to me, but the world. And so I think the thing for mine that's most telling is helping people see, 2 Corinthians 14 verse 15, the passion of Paul to see more and more people won, so that thanksgiving overflows to the glory of God. The vision through Acts of the numbers of people reached and the necessity of it going further and bigger and larger. I think people catching that is really the key thing, because that then brings into perspective decisions you make. Yeah.
It's great, isn't it? In the end, the strategy comes back to spiritual health, which is it's a great reminder. We've got now an opportunity for people to ask what they actually want to know. So I think I get fed questions and then throw them to you, Andrew. So somewhere along the way, Andrew, you mentioned the term warm person, and I think this is to do with mission. You know, the person who's warm to the gospel, perhaps. I'm not sure if we can, if Mark can get that clarified for us while you start answering. I think that's where it came up. What does that mean? What does it mean for someone to be warm? Isn't everyone hardened in sin and so on and so forth?
Yeah, well, theologically, of course, no one can come to the Father to Jesus unless the Father draws him, and not only aren't we able to do, we can't please God. There's all of that theology. We're dead in sin, but there is a prevenient grace of God. There's a grace of God that moves forward and out to arouse interest in people, such that when I bring a message or just a slight indication of the news of Jesus, that very news itself finds a landing ground and creates a landing ground in someone's.
And the Bible uses that language, doesn't it? It speaks in Romans 10 of the Jews being zealous for God, even though zeal's not based on knowledge, or the Thessalonians are more noble because they test the scripture to see if it's true. So
yeah, and as Paul goes out in his missionary journeys through Acts, he finds a ready reception. There's, I still have people here, so that encourages Paul to continue with the mission in Corinth. So there are people that I speak to. The thing I liken it to is opal mining. Either, you could drill the hole down to search for an opal in one spot, and you might or might not strike the person who's going to warmly respond to the gospel. Or you can cast more widely afield by doing open cut mining and find the vein of opal. Now, theologically, yes, that opal only comes by the prevenient grace of God through the declaration of the gospel. And they're the ones I'm looking for, the ones that God's touching and bringing his grace to.
Now, is there a warning there, Andrew? Is there a kind of warm person who is actually not a warm contact? Are there kind of eager receivers, receive the word at first with joy and then quickly fall away? How do you pick the difference between a warm contact and a faux warm contact?
Yeah. Well, the warm contact is someone who wants to take the conversation further, and they'll prove to be, a false warm contact when they stop taking the conversation further. So it's just pretty straightforward. You throw, in many ways, evangelism and mission is like throwing out burley or bait for fishing. You throw a little bit out, and if the fish comes towards you, you throw a bit more out, and it draws it further. And in all of our mission work, we're looking for that person who just wants to keep coming a little further with us, and we'll walk with them as they go further.
Yep.
But in our mission, we've often had people who, I think of some very good friends from one of the sports clubs I'm involved in, who they were interested in the conversation. They engaged with me. I got them to come to church. Then I got them to come to an evangelistic course we ran, and they walked with me all the way through that. Indicated a response at the end of that. Bought Bibles, were excited and enthusiastic, but they're proved at the moment to be the third sort. Wow. I keep walking with them, praying for them.
Yep.
Looking for opportunity, but I won't invest my whole life there. I haven't got time to. I'll keep walking with them as much as I can, but I'll...
Sorry to interrupt, Andrew. We'll move on just for time. So we've got another question here now's come up. Did aiming at a region affect the way you built your team? So thinking regionally, does that mean that the first person you employ or the first volunteer that you empower, you do that slightly differently?
I certainly did it differently to many I knew, in that the first guy I employed full-time was the maturity mission guy. I wanted to mobilise a team of congregation members who were growing in their passion for this work. So I had to work hard. I knew we had to invest enormous resource to mature people so they got the gospel and would run with us on it. And so we invested considerable money into a person to walk with me, help me in making that whole maturing process really go firing and really build up. But alongside that, we at the same time invested in mission. Now that meant we didn't invest money where most people wanted it, which was in the youth work.
I was about to say, so rather than serving the existing community, you're actually just further equipping them to serve the mission, right?
Yeah, exactly. So there's lots of things we didn't put on an administrative person because, I figured we could stumble along with, reasonable administration. But if we changed lives and changed hearts and mobilised a growing crowd, we'd be able to have a platform from which we could reach a bigger group. Yeah.
Great. Dave's got this question. Could you talk about some practical strategies for exposure to that larger community? Did you go after influencers and mavens, the people who really kind of know the ins and outs of stuff? Did you, what kind of strategies did you use to get raise awareness?
Yeah. We used public and so high level and low level. Yeah, I did look for the people who had high connectivity. And because, so we did a lot of maturing work into them. We tried to grow them so that they could use their connections to be a means of inviting and drawing people more and more. But we did the high level stuff.
Mavens is a reference to that book as well, isn't it? What's it called? The Tipping Point? That's a helpful book?
Yeah. It's always, tipping points are hard to manufacture, Yeah. I think often they happen, you can see it happening, and it's hard always to be the one that puts the fuel in the right place to make it happen. But nonetheless, we worked that. But we worked the high level thing. I think in a church plant context, one of the reasons church plants find it harder to grow is because they have no profile. And so the warm contact who might be, have had a conversation somewhere, seen something on TV, read a book, and begins to have an interest in the gospel, looks to go somewhere and connect with Christians. Well, a church plant doesn't figure because it's small and quiet and small. So we tried to do things, we tried to punch above our weight. We ran some high-level public events that we knew would be engaging and captivating for the family-orientated group we're in, and use that to kind of build profile and find the warm
punch above your weight. Yeah. So that means sometimes stretching your team and your budget to some of these things?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we resourced in slightly different areas for the sake of building the platform and profile for the future, rather than necessarily serving the immediate needs of the group we had. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think we've got time for at least one more question from Chris. You've kind of started to allude to this, but what role do evangelists play in your strategy? So,
yeah, look, my wife read to me a book the other day that said, would you rather have 10 100% sold out people to the gospel, or 190% sold out people to the gospel? And we both looked at each other and said, it's obvious. You'd always choose the 100 90%ers rather than the 10 100%ers. And because you can actually build profile, platform, reach more warm contacts, and so on. So the actual evangelist, the problem, if I can put it as, this is negative, but the problem with the evangelist is that if he's a personal evangelist, he's only going to reach a few people here and there. We're wanting to reach 30,000 people. And so you've got to have a lot of evangelists to reach 30,000 people. Now, in the early days of a church plant, if you've got an evangelist who's just that great gospel worker who speaks to people and shares and brings them in to hear more, encourage, nurture, free them. We didn't have many of those. And so we had to make do with the 90%ers who weren't passionate evangelists and try and mobilise them to do more than they do on their own.
Is it also a thing, sometimes the pro-evangelistic person thinks, let's employ someone who is the personal evangelist, when actually you need to employ the person who's the evangelist, enabler, and equipper, isn't it? That may be a different person.
Absolutely. There will be some contexts where you are so far back and in such barren soil that employing an evangelist and freeing him up full-time is a wise option. But in our context here, that would have been a very great waste of resource, because in 10 years' time, we still only would have had one evangelist doing one evangelist's works. But we employed the man who could mobilise many who weren't by nature evangelists or giftings, to do what they could with who they were, and so gain a greater foundation and platform of hundreds of people from whom you now find the evangelists.
So John's got a question now, which is a helpful one. It's the regional focus. He's saying, what about if you're a church of 50? And I could add to John's question, what about if you're in a geographical cul-de-sac of some kind? You're on a peninsula or in a, an outer suburb of a city, and so on and so forth. In what way should a regional focus kind of play into the mindset of those sorts of situations?
Look, in terms of, there's my unique context coming into a thing that's distinctly a region, and so I want to acknowledge there's some particularly unique dimensions of what we've done here. But I would say too, though, if I landed in a suburb, I would cast a vision as being larger than the particular 10 minutes around me or 15 minutes around me, for the sake of helping people see the dimensions of the task as being bigger than one church can achieve. I think for mine, that's the big key, is I want people to see the size and scale of the work, which means we have to partner with others. We have to start new works, and we have to make sure each work that we start will be bigger than we're comfortable with. We want it all to be growing, and we need lots of things growing because the scale's so large. So I would always cast a vision bigger than just the local suburb. Absolutely.
And so some of those churches may have a regional interest in prayer and giving and whatever else, even if that church may be a slower growing one. It's thinking regional in its identity.
I think the reason too that I was just sorry, Mike. I was going to say the reason we actually encourage each other to be on about overseas mission is the same thing. We want people to see the gospel is for all nations. It's not just for my suburb, it's for all suburbs, it's for the whole city, it's for the whole country. And I think that brings a health back into my own personal evangelism as well.
Okay, we've got a 2-minute warning, Andrew, and one question that flows in really nicely from this. Question from Dan. If you're aiming for a region, should you be measuring conversions and church growth across the region, not just your church?
I think you've got an issue of credibility with the people you're working with, and one of the issues of credibility is if you're a church of 30, 40, 50, and I start measuring what's happening across 300,000 as if we have some responsibility for that, then you can actually create a divide between the vision you're trying to create and people's willingness to walk with you on it. But nonetheless, I think it's helpful for perspective for people to see. So in our instance here, I've added up all the people in church across the whole region, and I've said to people, there's 6,000 people in church in this whole region. We've got a lot to do, but I've not then paid attention to how many are converted in each of those other churches, because we've got a lot in our own context as well.
Great. Great. Look, I think that's it. So, Andrew, this has been fun. I hope it's been helpful for people. The questions have been terrific. So I'll get to do it again sometime soon, I hope. But I think now
is a challenge.
Yeah, trying to cut you off is also a challenge. So there you have it. Let's throw to Mark, and he'll wrap up for us, huh?
Yep. Thanks very much, guys.
Cheers.
And my thanks to Andrew for participating and Mikey for being our host today. Now, fellas, if you are actually new to this, you'll probably see that we're also a bit new. We're learning how to take care of all the different technology we're dealing with at the same time as putting out PowerPoints and things. So, yes, we did put the wrong heading, mother-daughter planting, over a bunch of power slides. But that said, it's a good time to actually draw your attention to the various things that are coming up. If you're going to be in Perth, if you're in WA in this month, then you really should see if you can get along to Church Planning Landmines. Our steward will be in town, and he'll be talking about the most common mistakes church planners make on March 19. All the details are on our website, so we encourage you to have a look at those. Also, if you've enjoyed this experience or you think to yourself, gosh, I wish I was one of those guys who got a question in, because I realise there are a bunch of people who didn't, we'd like to say thank you for participating and encourage you to join us on our next webinar on April 10. At that time, we'll be talking to Bryson Smith about planting in the country. It's true, not everybody is planting a church in a metropolis. And so what does it take to plant in the country? What are the different attitudes, strategies that you need to be successful in something that's more of a country region than it is, in fact, a metropolis area? So there's another issue they'll be taking up. And once again, we'd like to thank EA Insurance for actually making this entire thing possible. The services they provide are services that are tailored particularly to church planters, so you can contact them and work out what it is that you need to insure and the best possible way it's going to make cost-effective sense for you. They are a Christian organisation, and they basically set aside a certain amount of their work so that they can make the gospel progress forward, and this is how they're helping the kingdom do that. Now, you probably want to think to yourself, what could I have asked? Or maybe what did Andrew say about something and I really want to follow it up? Well, this event will be on the website, the Geneva Push website, available through our events calendar and also through our resources calendar. So that'll be coming up next week or so. And before you sign off, we'd like to encourage you, before you leave, to take the survey. You'll basically be given a survey in a second, which will ask you how we can improve this. And it's basically just that, 4 questions, whether you'd like it shorter or longer, whether you'd like more opportunity for questions, those sorts of things. If you tell us, we'll put it to a good effect. Thanks very much, everybody, for attending. We've had people actually from all over Australia and one person from overseas too, so special thanks to you two for tuning in. And we hope that this has been useful, and we look forward to you joining us on our next webinar.